So we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Tani Alvarez, and I am a partner in Verrill's Labor and Employment Practice Group. And joining me today in this presentation is Liz Johnston, an associate in the Labor and Employment Practice Group. So if you have not yet met or had the opportunity to work directly with Liz, I highly recommend reaching out to her after this presentation because she's been with us now for about 2.5 years and she's doing just an amazingly stellar job. So she's going to give a wave. Today, we are going to talk about uncovering employee covering, specifically addressing authenticity in your diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. This is the fourth segment in this year's annual employment law update. For those of you who have been with us historically, you know that we used to really enjoy getting together with all of you in January for a full day-long seminar to discuss all of the newest trends and topics that are occurring in labor and employment. But because of the pandemic this year, we pivoted to an online version that'll last the whole year, with all of us meeting on the third Thursday of every month for an hour or an hour and a half to discuss a given topic. This month, we're talking about uncovering and how covering is affecting your DEI program. And next month, we haven't decided yet, but it is either going to be an update on OSHA and what's going on within that administrative agency, or you're going to get a firsthand look at the PRO Act, which is currently pending in the federal legislature. So, Anne, let's kick it off and move to that first slide.
Good morning, everyone. So first, to get started, I just wanted to provide everybody with a brief outline of what we'll be talking about over the course of the presentation today so that you can know what to expect. First, as Tani mentioned, we're going to focus on the concept of covering at work, sort of talking about what it is, different types of covering that occur in the workplace, and why it's important and how to recognize it when we're talking about increasing diversity and inclusion efforts in the workplace. After that, we'll talk a little bit about implicit bias, again, how that plays a role in D&I programming. And one of the specific topics that we'll be focusing on today is referral bonuses. Lastly, we'll be focusing our discussion on various topics, really, various programming that can be offered for diversity and inclusion, specifically focusing on voluntary affirmative action programs and the Rooney Rule, and of course talking about how to stay legally compliant when you're executing those types of programs in your workplace, as well as factors to consider when we're evaluating the effectiveness of various diversity and inclusion outcomes.
So we'll go to the next slide. And this is just to give us an outline of what we're going to cover. So we're going to talk about covering, specifically what is covering, and then the role it plays in diversity and inclusion programs. So let's jump right on into what is covering. So covering is attempts to minimize personality characteristics or attributes that are based on societal stigmas. Throughout the course of this presentation, we're going to be focusing extensively on a Deloitte University Leadership Center for Inclusion report entitled Uncovering Talent. In this report, it was revealed that 61% of all employees cover their identities in some ways. When we say covering, we don't necessarily mean that the employee is purposefully hiding some aspects of themselves, but instead maybe downplaying it for fear of drawing unwanted attention to themselves, or based off of fear of drawing unwanted attention to themselves, or they could be fearful that that aspect of themselves will make other people feel uncomfortable. I'm sure some of you are thinking to yourself, why are Tani and Liz presenting on this? How does this affect the legal landscape? What does it have to do with labor and employment law? It seems much more something that we would talk to a social scientist about or an HR consultant. Well, the thing is if we have employees who are covering, who are not free to be their authentic self at work. And when I say free, I don't just mean that we're restricting them, but also they just generally feel as though they're restricted. How are these employees going to report unsafe or illegal behavior? How are they going to report when they've been sexually harassed or when they've witnessed sexual harassment? How or why would they report racial or national origin harassment? So often, Liz and I deal with cases in which an individual or a plaintiff is alleging some form of harassment or discrimination, but we can't point to a specific instance in which this has been brought to our attention. And in a lot of situations, we hear that it wasn't brought to our attention because somebody didn't feel comfortable making the report. Or maybe they did make the report, but they didn't do it in a direct way to HR, but they texted a supervisor or manager or something to that effect. We know that that makes our job of defending against a harassment or discrimination claim that much more difficult. So we know that 61% of our employees may be covering in some way, but is this a bigger issue? And it is, in fact, and it's a historical issue as well. Many famous individuals had covered throughout the course of the work that they've done. So FDR and Margaret Thatcher are two very visible forms of covering. FDR often would downplay his disability. He often had pictures taken of him behind a desk so that you couldn't see his wheelchair. Specifically, as you look historically through books, you don't see a lot of images of him in the wheelchair because he wanted to downplay or cover that disability. Margaret Thatcher, in fact, had a voice coach because many individuals in her social circle were very fearful of the fact that her dialect, she grew up the daughter of a fishmonger, would decrease her perception and the strength that she had with the nation generally. So who else is covering? Is this only a diversity issue? The answer is no. The statistics are staggering. 83% of LGB individuals cover. 79% of Black employees are covering. 67% of women of color cover. 66% of women in general in the workplace cover, and 45% of heterosexual white men cover. This is an issue that faces all individuals, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation. And it's something that we have to talk more about, and that we have to educate ourselves more on so that we can help individuals become their authentic self at work. Let's go to the next slide. So why is this important? We talked about the fact that discrimination and harassment is going to be less likely to be reported if someone feels as though they can't be their full self. Authenticity is so important. And there's a lot of studies that talk about how individuals have these multiple identities that depend on the social context. So they have their business persona at work. They have their friend persona when they are at book club or when they're out for coffee. They have their parent persona at home or at bedtime. All of these personas, however, and it's too early in the morning. Compartmentalizing those identities is not healthy for the individual. And not just that, but research into this subject shows that people who compartmentalize different aspects of their identity are found to be at a higher likelihood to engage in unethical behavior. So when they're separating their personal and their business lives, studies are showing that an individual who is asked to flip a coin 100 times is more likely to cheat and say that they guessed the right coin flip during the course of experiment. So having ethical employees, having individuals who feel like they are their authentic selves at work, that's the big reason why we want to talk about covering and helping HR and senior leaders uncover their employees to increase their talent, to increase longevity with the organization, and just to create a healthier environment. When we're talking about covering, we're going to specifically talk about 4 different forms of covering, and Liz and I are going to go into much more extensive detail about these 4. It's appearance covering, affiliation covering, advocacy covering, and associational covering. So let's jump into a discussion about each of those.
So first, we'll dive a little bit deeper into what's called appearance-based covering. And this relates to how individuals present themselves to others. So it can relate to, as Tawny had alluded to, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability, even things like military status and socioeconomic status can be top, ways that, or things that people attempt to cover from an appearance perspective. So it's how people try to hide or mask a certain aspect of themselves, both in appearance and also in personality and mannerisms, to better fit in and blend in the workplace. So Tawny had used an example of FDR covering his disability, and that's a classic example of that. But we can also see covering of disabilities with things like people not using canes when they don't need to, or trying to restrict the use of hearing aids to reduce the implication of a disability or an age related factor. The Deloitte study that we're drawing from today also provided a number of examples from people who are subjects to this study and how they've covered in the workplace. And one of the respondents talked about how they had covered themselves from a gender perspective. And there was a woman that responded that she wears clothes to appear more masculine and models male behavior to break down barriers to success, goes to places that men like to go to be part of her group at work, downplays her interest in feminine things. And so that's an example of really how significant appearance-based covering can present itself, and that people change the perception of what they're interested in, what they like to do, how they dress, how they act in order to attempt to defeat stereotypes and associations that may be related to women. And again, it's not necessarily an intentional or a deliberate or fraudulent in any way. It's just a response that people are having to these preconceptions in the workplace. This happens when we're covering race as well. One of the respondents stated that they overcome for Asian stereotypes by doing their best to speak up, speak clearly, and carry themselves in a confident manner. And while these can sort of at first blush seem to be good things, it's troubling that people feel that they are changing their personality in order to blend in with what's expected, and something that might not necessarily be natural. Socioeconomic status, this can present itself in the clothing that people wear, trying to wear brands and styles that sort of are part of the on trend or expected of them at work, to defeat the implication that they can't afford it or have come from a lower socioeconomic background. And so we have some of these statistics up here, and over 29% of the people in this study had admitted that they engaged in appearance-based covering at work. So that's nearly 1 in 3 employees. But what's even more concerning is the percentage of those people that feel that appearance-based covering is crucial to their professional advancement. And regardless of whether or not that's true, the perception of a significant portion of the workforce is that how they present themselves, which might not necessarily be who they are, is more important or a significant factor in how they're going to do at work rather than talent-based criteria. Can jump to the next one.
So next we're going to talk about affiliation covering. And specifically, I do want to invite people to make comments or ask questions within the chat function. As time allows, Liz and I will respond to those questions as we're moving through the slides. But I think this is a good moment for everyone to take a moment and think. I find so often that when I'm at a seminar, when I'm learning new material, I am taking all of it in and it's like the fire hose. And I'm not taking the time to say, wait a second, this has such bigger implications. So a lot of the people who are attending today are working really hard to create diversity and inclusion programs, to create an environment that has more diverse employees in which they feel more inclusive. What Liz just said means that even if you're bringing in diverse talent, a lot of them are likely covering and not being their authentic self. So that diversity that you made a business case for, and we all know makes sense and is necessary from a moral standpoint, from a production standpoint, from every argument we want to make in support of diversity. In fact, if and the statistics show that 61% of people are covering, it's because they don't feel as though you have an inclusive environment, and there's larger general social constructs that are forcing them to feel this way. So now let's jump to a second form of covering. And this is affiliation-based covering. So data from that same Deloitte survey we talked about earlier found that 40% of respondents indicated that they engaged in affiliation-based covering, and 79% believed that affiliation-based covering was somewhat to extremely important to their long-term professional advancement. So over 3/4 of half of the respondents believed that it was important for their advancement. These aren't small numbers. But what is affiliation covering? Affiliation covering is different in that it's when individuals avoid behaviors that are widely associated with something they identify with. And what they're doing is they're often attempting to negate negative stereotypes about that identity. So as an example, an individual of Asian descent who responded to the survey indicated, I try to stay away from work that's stereotypical of Asians, specifically math assignments. You had a woman who reported that she was coached by a mentor to not mention family commitments, including daycare pickup, in conversations that she had with executive management, because those individuals in management frowned on flexible work arrangements. You have individuals who are covering their age, who indicated that they were worried that their age would block them from promotion since they were older than many of the other individuals who were in a similar position. So that individual is very careful not to mention their age or anything that might date them more generally. Imagine having conversations with peers or managers in which you are constantly thinking about whether any of the things that you're saying could date you. The toys you played with, the television shows that you watch, PG jokes that come from some type of societal engagement or norm. That's what's going through your employees' minds constantly as they cover these certain aspects of them with the hopes of advancing within your organization. So let's jump to the third form of covering, advocacy covering.
So advocacy covering is related to the degree to which individuals stick up for or advocate for others in a group, particularly their group. So on this screen, we have some examples again from the Deloitte study to demonstrate what that looks like. It can be on an individual level where, for example, we have someone responding to citizen status, and they indicated that they don't feel comfortable talking about politics for fear of being told that if they don't like it, they can just leave. An example of this in the gender context, someone indicated that they try not to make gender an issue at all. And I never suggest it is an issue, and do not bring up gender bias as a factor when considering applicants, etc., even if I suspect it might be present. And in the Deloitte study, this was actually one of the most prominent types of covering, with 37% of people responding that they had participated in advocacy-based covering at some point, and 75 believing that it somewhat or extremely related to their opportunity for professional advancement. And so this type of covering specifically, I think, is really important to recognize, because it's not necessarily just about the individual that's engaging in the covering, but it potentially has a significant impact on other people. The gender example, if somebody's covering in an advocacy related context and they're seeing gender bias happening or suspecting that gender bias is going on in recruitment or hiring, and they're not saying anything about it because they're feeling they're covering in this way, that could potentially impact the people that are coming into the company and the behavior of other people, which could potentially also raise legal issues if there's some sort of discriminatory intent going on there. But even on a smaller level, one of the examples is for race and ethnicity. This person said that even though they're of Chinese descent, they don't stop people from making jokes about Asian descent when they hear them. And on a personal level, that's troubling because you have that person subjected to behavior, but it also means that other people could be exposed to the same type of behavior, and also potentially reinforcing it and allowing it to continue, all because of advocacy covering. And the next type that we'll talk about is associational covering.
So associational covering concerns how individuals may avoid contact with other similar group members. So this would be, I think, one of the big examples, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, is employees who refuse to participate in an affinity group at work because they don't want to be specifically identified based off of that characteristic. So in the Deloitte study, 29% of respondents admitted to some form of associational covering, and 79% of that 29% stated that they believe that that covering was somewhat to extremely important in their long-term professional advancement. So we gave the example of affinity groups, but some of the other examples that were given in the study were women who were afraid to sponsor another woman because they were afraid that they might get a reputation or be seen as somebody who would only sponsor women. We had employees who responded that they would refuse to bring a +1 to any work event because they were afraid that people would judge them based off of their same-sex partner. And then they were afraid that if at work they were mentoring LGBT plus individuals, that they further would be labeled as an individual who only mentored and sponsored LGBTQ plus individuals. So how does this then relate to the affinity groups? This is that moment that if we were alive, I would love to see a show of hands as to the number of people in the audience who have created affinity groups that have failed. Oftentimes, and especially I'd say in the last 9 months, when organizations have been talking about affinity groups, what Liz and I hear so often is, we tried affinity groups a few years ago and it didn't work. For the organizations in which it has worked, I hear tremendous successes come out of it. There's legal risk in affinity groups, and if you search on our podcasts and our blog posts, we set forth those legal risks. Right now, we're not going to focus on those, but we're going to talk about the strengths of affinity groups and the fact that if you're attempting to create one, covering very likely could be ruining your chance of success with that affinity group before you even begin. So if you have individuals in your organization who are covering, who refuse to go to parenting affinity groups, who refuse to go to a Black affinity group or an Indigenous affinity group. All of these different affinity groups that could be in play within your organization may be unsuccessful because of the amount of covering that you have within your organization and the concern that your employees have that their participation in those groups will further label them or be detrimental to their career advancement. Let's jump ahead and talk about more about the role in diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, so I mean, now that we have a better understanding of what covering is and how it presents itself, you know, the fundamental issue is that it affects people's perceptions of how they're able to succeed in their organization, but also we're talking about people covering who they intrinsically are. And as Tani's used the phrase being their authentic selves. Really, this is so important in diversity and inclusion efforts because all of the efforts that you put forth really depend on people being who they are and opening up and sort of participating in the organization within those efforts. But if people aren't being authentic, then it becomes really difficult to focus on you know, creating a positive work environment, an inclusive work environment. And we know that when people don't feel included and aren't satisfied, that productivity can suffer, retention can suffer, all of those which can affect sort of your broader business goals and the day-to-day, of course. And we have some of these statistics from the Deloitte study talking about the number of people who feel that covering is really detrimental to their sense of self. And for that reason, it's so important to recognize and consider covering when you're implementing various programs, and also educating your management team and other employees on this concept so that you can look for it in your organization, understand where it's happening, and potentially take steps to address what might be causing that, and also providing people the opportunity to uncover and focus on more inclusivity.
So as we're talking about covering, I mean, the need to cover is oftentimes coming from biases within your organization. And those may be implicit biases, they might be explicit biases. I think we see fewer and fewer explicit biases lately, considering the current cultural atmosphere. But it's important, and we're going to run through very briefly different forms of implicit bias, but then we're going to get into a little bit more detail about communication issues that we see as a result of implicit bias, and then how, from an institutional standpoint, this could be forcing or leading your employees to cover. And again, why is that problematic? Because if you have these biases and you have employees who are covering, your ability to create an inclusive work environment is going to be hindered. And at the end of the day, when you're talking to your senior leaders and they're saying, how did we fail or why did we fail? These are likely some of the reasons why you've been unable to achieve the goals that you had previously set out. So let's jump into some forms of implicit bias.
So for anyone who's attended some of our talks in the past, I know you may have seen these slides before and heard us talk about these issues, but they're still really important to focus on. And for anybody who's new, we'll sort of talk about an overview of implicit bias and also cognitive biases. So the infographic here talks about some of the different biases that can come into play. And, you know, these biases really affect the way we process information, and they happen on a subconscious level. So it's implicit in that sense, you know, and that these things are happening on a lower level that we might not notice. And so awareness is sort of the first step to be able to combat those. So just as a couple examples of what implicit and these cognitive biases are, one type is a confirmation bias. And this is the type of bias where we tend to listen only to information that confirms what we already believe. And this is apparent when we have a belief about something, so you might research information that already supports your belief rather than looking for an opposing side. As a practical example, someone might have a bias that individuals who went to a certain college or university are really good at math and stellar employees in that field. So they might focus on recruitment or studies that show that people from that college or university are in fact good at math and would be great in that context. So you really focus on information supporting what you already believe rather than getting the full viewpoint of looking at an opposing side. Bandwagon bias is also a really interesting one, especially in employment context. This is the phenomenon where you are more likely to believe something the more people that believe it. So the image here makes sort of a joke that this is why meetings are so unproductive in the workplace, is because of bandwagon bias. But it is an important theory to be aware of because oftentimes we do have groups of people coming together with different viewpoints, different reasons for those viewpoints, and understanding that your view might be swayed or your opinions might be swayed depending on how many other people are in the room who believe a certain thing. And there might not necessarily be, or without focusing on the reason for why you have a shifting belief or believe a certain thing, that might affect decision making. Another important one to understand is choice supportive bias. This is when someone makes a choice, you feel good about it, even if the choice has flaws, because you will brush those aside or tend to ignore those. And a really kind of a silly example is, let's say you're at a restaurant and you choose something off the menu. You might think you have the best dish at the table, the best entree at the table. It might come out a little cold. It might be missing a few of its sides, but you will still believe that you made the best choice because you made the choice. So it's hiding those, hiding the flaws because you selected something.
I mean, to add on to what Liz just said from like the bandwagon biases, for those of you who are currently working at home with children, this is something that the bias is ingrained with us as children. I mean, I was overhearing a third grade Zoom lesson a few weeks ago in which they were all trying to brainstorm what would be a fun science project that they all could do at home. And one child who I swear is able to bring the solar system into every single conversation that is held, no matter what the topic is, he can bring the solar system in, thought it would be really cool to make the solar system out of cheese. And the response that he got from his peers and the classmate were such that I think if I was that child, I would not bring, that subject up again. And so his authenticity, his differences, his diversity within that class is now going to be covered more often because, the bias from the group said, no, that's not a good idea, even though we had created a platform that said, right now we're just throwing out ideas, we're just going to talk about it. But when somebody shows the flaws in the problem kind of initially, and I think that some of these concepts have been with us societally for so long that we don't understand how detrimental it is to our creation of diversity and inclusion within the workplace. So somehow I was able to get cheese and the solar system into this presentation, Liz, and I know we didn't plan that, but I think it's important for all of us to understand that this isn't something that just happened once we graduated from college or high school. Instead, these are things that have been drilled into our brain since we've been children.
Next slide, please. Oh, perfect. Yeah, so just talking about a few more of these, outcome bias is another one that's important to be aware of. And that's where we look at the result of a situation and use that as justification of the decision being a good one. So the example here is, you win a lot of money in Las Vegas doesn't necessarily mean that gambling was a good idea. But I think in the employment context, we see this where you have an employee, you might have an employee who turned out to be a really great employee and they are doing a great job, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the employee was the best candidate or that you engaged in the best recruiting practices to get that candidate or that there weren't better candidates. So it's looking at and potentially there could be other biases at play that sort of result in outcome bias occurring, but the outcome sort of justifies the choice in this type of bias. Another one is selective perception, and that's where we allow expectations about how things are and how they affect how we perceive the world. An example of this, again, in the employment context, is where you might have two different employees, and maybe one is a new parent. So you might have an implicit bias or an implicit feeling, again, maybe don't recognize it, but you might expect that they might have some difficulty adapting to their role and maintaining their workload and maintaining performance. So selective perception might cause someone to notice that that new parent is coming to work late more than the other person and defaulting on their performance in some way. But the other employee could very well be engaging in the same behavior, but selective perception causes someone to only look at the outcome for the person that they're expecting it from. Another one, just to throw it out there, is recency. This is where we tend to put higher weight on information that's more recent rather than older. Again, it's important to take into account the full range of behaviors, performance, and information available rather than just what's most recent. So just a few more biases to be aware of.
So let's jump to individual versus systemic bias. I mean, Liz has just talked about a number of individual implicit biases, and throughout it, we've also discussed how that can create more of a systemic bias within a group or an organization or during a meeting. But it's important to remember that your individual bias is going to be specific to each individual person, and it can be explicit or implicit. But that individual bias can also be part of a much larger, either institutional or systemic bias that we have within our culture. Specifically, why are we talking about this? Why am I repeating it? Policies, practices, and procedures that you have in the workplace. So you know that when you contact Liz and I and you say, I'm thinking of creating a policy or a procedure that provides X, Y, and Z. In most situations, we're like, that's great. Documents, policies, and writing are really good if you're ever sued and there's an allegation that you treated one employee differently from another. We can point to the policy and say, no, it wasn't because of a protected class, it was because of this policy. But the problem with policies is that they're only effective as the people who are creating them. And we see this a lot with artificial intelligence. The people who are programming or creating artificial intelligence that may be used to screen your applicant pool, that may be used to assist you in identifying candidates who are going to be appropriate for leadership positions. Those all have implicit bias fault based off of the data that has been inputted. So let's say that one of your strongest performers in your organization is, let's say it's a Hispanic woman who went to Yale and played lacrosse. So you're going to insert all of that data as saying like, this is who we know is the highest performing, and we want more employees like her, right? So now all the applications that include someone who says that an activity or something they enjoy is lacrosse is going to be bumped to the top of the pile. Now, consider what lacrosse is, right? Well, okay, lacrosse can be played by men and women, so there's no gender issue there, right? And there's no limitation as to who can play. There's no rules that say you have to be a certain race or only a certain ethnicity. But think about some of the other factors, right? Lacrosse is a sport in which a significant amount of equipment is necessary to play, which means from a socioeconomic standpoint, right, you're looking primarily at people who can afford all the equipment that's necessary to play lacrosse. You're also looking at the opportunity to play lacrosse. So is it in small towns? Is it in small communities? Not likely, because of some of the socioeconomic aspects of the sport itself. So things that on its face appear as though it's non-discriminatory are creating biases within your process. For those of you who aren't specifically aware, don't follow, the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity is an amazing resource in this area. And they have a study concerning institutional interventions to prevent implicit bias from undermining organizational diversity. And one of the things they note within that study is that before the hiring process even begins within your organization, the pool of potential applicants is going to be shaped by structural inequalities, both within your organization and within all levels of society. So what does that mean? It means that when you're creating policies and practices, you have to think further about how these policies or practices are going to either help or hinder your diversity initiatives. What are the job duties and responsibilities? Are those prerequisites available to individuals without regard to race, class, all of those things? When you are advertising the position, where are you advertising it? Are you advertising it in a format or in a way in which people with all different forms of means are going to be able to become aware of the position? Additionally, and one of the things that's most difficult is that oftentimes institutional or systemic bias is something that we can't identify until after a catastrophe has occurred. So we know, and some of the examples would be Katrina, and the disproportionate number of deaths of people of color versus white individuals. We also know it from a COVID standpoint and the disproportionality between deaths based off of race. Unfortunately, in many situations, for us to identify these institutional biases, first the catastrophe has to occur. In a lot of situations, an organization wouldn't be able to survive a catastrophe of that magnitude. And we call it bet the company cases. So we call them cases in which the allegations that are being made against the organization are such that the damages that are in place or being alleged and the attorney's fees are such that the company is going to go under if the finding is not in the company's favor. So a race discrimination class action, a national origin class action, a multi-employee sexual harassment claim. All of those types of cases are such that if you are unaware of your institutional or systemic issues, that they're bet the company litigation. Let's move on and talk a little bit more about referral bonuses.
Yeah, so, I'm sure many of you know, recruiting can be tough. Finding candidates can be tough because there are so many different ways to look for candidates. And as Tawny was referencing, there's the effort that needs to be put into looking in the right places. So a lot of times it can be a very appealing option to look at your stellar talent pool and see who they know. Employees know the job, they know what makes a successful employee in that role. And so they might potentially know people who are qualified to also be successful at the company. But the problem is when we're talking about referral bonuses, the focus really gets put on the employees to dig into their own networks. And what we've seen is that people tend to have networks with other people like themselves. And this isn't necessarily intentional, but it's really the result of how implicit bias starts shaping us from a very, very early age, and who we associate with, who we grow up with, where we grow up, where we go to school. So if you think about it, our networks when we're adults in the working world are often built from places like where we went to college and our local communities, groups of people that have similar interests, maybe people who have similar religious affiliations. So referral bonuses, essentially cause us to cast a net into the same pond of people that we already have, and we might be missing out on a much larger group of well-qualified individuals who aren't necessarily part of those networks. We also might be missing out on people who perhaps aren't as skilled at networking. I believe there's been research that says that women tend to network a little bit less than men. So men oftentimes, could be more significantly benefited by things like referral bonuses. So, really we're incentivizing looking at a pool of people that isn't necessarily as diverse as we would otherwise get if an organization didn't focus only on referral bonuses. But even after sort of casting that net, referral bonuses can also raise a number of issues in how an actual applicant is considered. So even if we're using referrals and using other alternative means, again, these biases can come into play in how we consider these candidates. Think about the fact that if you have somebody that's referred, the first thing you know about them is that they are connected in some way with one of your current employees. And so perceptions about that current employee might be attributed to the candidate. There might be sort of an instant positive impression that you get from that candidate because they're associated with and recommended by one of the employees that's already performing really well. And we might give that particular weight, even though there might be other aspects of the candidate that aren't as favorable. One of these biases also that's significant here is called a framing bias. And that's where we weigh information differently based on how it's presented. So somebody who comes in with a referral and that initial positive impression, you need to think about whether that candidate would be just as well qualified or comparatively well qualified to others if they had come through just as a normal application, or whether we're weighing people who come in through different channels of recruitment differently than those who come in as referrals, just based on the way that we receive the information in the first place. So the question, of course, that we're asking is, do referral bonuses adversely affect diversity and inclusion initiatives? And the answer is it could. It definitely could, just again, based on where we're casting a net and the types of decisions and implicit bias that we're potentially coming into play in the decision-making role there as well.
So we're going to run through a handful of slides that I think for most of our guests are going to be fairly natural and intuitive to them concerning creating successful diversity and inclusion programs. But we're going to spend more time on voluntary affirmative action and the Rooney Rule specifically. So let's go to the next slide, Anne. We know that diversity and inclusion are interrelated. Inclusion can't occur unless we have a diverse pool of applicants for different positions. But even before applications are reviewed, who's part of the hiring process? Where are we recruiting from? What benefits are we using to entice? This is one of those times where I have found myself talking to and discussing ways to reach goals concerning diversity within the workplace with diversity professionals, so individuals who you may be hiring, consultants that you're bringing in to advise on diversity and inclusion. And so often what they are recommending is against the law. This is why where we find ourselves right now is so difficult to achieve movement, because what needs to occur in order to create, in most situations, a more diverse and inclusive environment can't occur. So we see, Microsoft and Morgan Stanley received letters from the EEOC last summer after they had indicated that, I think by 2025, we promise, or it is our goal, that we are going to have senior managers that are people of color who make up X percentage of our workforce. Having statistics or having ratios like that in most situations are going to be illegal, because you're making hiring choices based off of race, which is in violation of Title VII. So Title VII says you can't take race, ethnicity, or gender into account when making hiring decision, even if that is in order to provide an opportunity for an individual of color, or for a female, or another group of individuals who is underrepresented within your organization, right? So instead, we have to focus in on how do we create diversity in ways that are permissible. And that's going to be taking a long, hard look as to where we're recruiting from, whether or not the benefits that we're offering to all of our employees are such that it's going to entice a diverse pool of applicants to join us. Do we have an organization in which individuals don't feel they need to cover their true identity? Are we creating an inclusive environment? When talent leaves our organization, is your senior management taking a good look at themselves and saying, why were we unable to retain this individual? Or are they making excuses saying, it's a them issue, not an us issue? And I hear that so often. Organizations who are refusing to hold themselves accountable for their failure to reach their diversity and inclusion goals generally. So let's talk about some things that you might be doing that are implicitly decreasing diversity and inclusion within your environment. I'll go to the next slide.
Yeah, so briefly touching on, and we'll get to talk about language here in just a moment, but the key to combating bias we've talked a lot about today, and really is the reason that you all are here, is education is the key way to combat bias. Knowing what it is, where it presents itself, and what types there are. That's the first step in order to be able to understand where it occurs in the workplace and learn how to address it. Along that line, awareness. We've talked a lot today about awareness of bias in the interviewing, hiring, recruiting process, and also making sure that we have an understanding that it does infiltrate into areas like promotion, discipline, termination, and it's important for this information and awareness to filter down not only from the organization's leaders, top leadership, but also on a management level, because those are the people making day-to-day decisions regarding employees and engaging in those day-to-day interactions. Accountability is also really key, because we talk about policies and procedures and having these things laid out and these goals laid out, but really having a system where your organization is staying accountable to those goals and following those policies and procedures is key to making sure that the role of bias is diminished. And lastly, third-party intervention training is something that's definitely become more prevalent over the past few years, and that's potentially having a third-party organization come in to discuss these issues, educate your workforce, and raise awareness about these topics. So just briefly talking about some of the ways that bias presents itself in the workplace. Language is really key. We talk about actual practices, but the language we use on a daily basis can really be important in, or watching the language that we use on a daily basis can be important in diminishing the impact of bias and stereotypes and preconceptions in the workplace. So, looking at phrases that we use sort of on a regular basis and understanding that some of these phrases have roots in things that are not as friendly, and just being aware that we presented a few different examples here of language and how it comes from has a potentially more negative background, and just being aware that that exists. And then on the next slide, again, sort of talking about language that we use all the time that can have a really negative connotation when it's used in the workplace. You know, a lot of these phrases I'm sure you've heard, and you know, it's just important to understand how they may implicate certain groups or play to certain stereotypes. We have things like, you know, working mom, boys will be boys. This type of language sort of endorses or punishes behavior that's implicit in gender or potentially race. And it's just, it can be really damaging when we attach that negative connotation to it and use it even in a colloquial manner in the workplace.
We're going to jump into voluntary affirmative action plans and the Rooney Rule, but we also have a couple of Q&A. Those don't fit exactly into the next two slides, but we're gonna cover it after. We know that the program ends in 4 minutes, so those of you who need to leave, please feel free to leave at 10:30. Otherwise, you're welcome to stay as we discuss some of the pending questions. So voluntary affirmative action plans. Some of you may work in an organization that currently has government contracts that require some form of an affirmative action plan based off of contractual arrangements with the government. If you don't fall within one of those subsections, then you likely don't have an affirmative action plan, but maybe you've considered creating a voluntary affirmative action plan in which you have goals to employ and maintain the employment of a certain percentage of individuals which fall within protected classes over the course of a period of time, whether those are veterans, whether or not they're women, whether or not they're racial or ethnical diverse. In order, however, to have a legal voluntary affirmative action plan, three aspects are going to need to be included. One, the plan has to be remedial in nature. Specifically, you're admitting that there's been past discrimination or possible adverse impact as to the group in question. So it can't just be, we need to hire more diverse people. You have to specifically identify and target the underrepresented group within your organization. And specifically, that's because we know Title VII prohibits practices or procedures that have an adverse impact unless it's justified by business necessity. So if you have a policy that tends to deprive a person of equal employment opportunities, it's going to be very strictly scrutinized to determine if there's an adverse impact. And if there is an adverse impact, we're going to have to show that, in fact, this is remedial in nature because there was past discrimination, whether implicit or explicit, that was occurring. Second, the plan does not unnecessarily interfere with the interests of non-minority employees. Accordingly, you can't say by the end of the year we'll have 5 individuals of color in senior leadership positions. Okay, nobody resigns or leaves your organization this year, so you terminate 5 white employees. No, because the interests of that non-minority employee, right, can't be interfered with in order to replace them with diverse employees. Last year, we saw a number of white men and women who gave up board seats on public companies, indicating that they wanted the seat to go to an individual of color or a Black representative. Those themselves, the organization wasn't terminating the employee, but if there was the ability to hire, or include an individual who was a non-minority versus a minority, taking that minority status into account without having a voluntary affirmative action plan could be dangerous. Finally, the plan or program that's created has to be temporary in nature, and the goal has to be to achieve some type of balance without maintenance. So maybe the program is 3 years in length or in nature, but it can't be over the course of this period of time. We will increase individuals of color more generally through the organization. Let's jump to the Rooney Rule.
Yeah, so if anybody out there is a football or sports fan, you might have heard of the Rooney Rule. But basically what this is it was created in the early 2000s for the National Football League, named after Dan Rooney, following the firings of 2 African-American head coaches. So the NFL has had a historic issue with hiring people of color in the head coach position. So what this rule said was teams need to interview and consider at least one minority group applicant for the head coach position when one needed to be filled. So this actually had a really significant impact on hiring. There was a much greater amount of hiring that was occurring for people of color in the head coach position once this rule went into effect. Since then, there have been, questions about the advocacy, and the rule's been amended and actually expanded to general manager and front office positions in the NFL. And since it was created, other sports organizations have also created similar rules, and companies are expanding the use of this type of program as well. So one key distinction here that I think is really important to highlight is the difference between interviewing and hiring. Because I know all of you probably know, or hopefully know, that race or color cannot be used as a basis for hiring or not hiring somebody. But putting more people in the interview pool and opening the door to having a more diverse group of applicants really was shown to be effective in helping to build a more diverse workforce, and is an appropriate way and a legally acceptable way to potentially increase that diversity of the employment group as well. One thing to consider, from a perspective in a certain organization, is that your channels of recruitment need to be large enough to find applicants. So Tani talked a little bit earlier about making sure that when we're advertising positions and recruiting, making sure that we're recruiting from areas and channels that'll give us the opportunity to have a diverse applicant pool. And another consideration to keep in mind is that the diversity of the hiring team can really affect how people do in the hiring process. And so things like the Rooney Rule are interesting because you can track sort of how people are doing in the recruitment process and the hiring process, and keep in mind who's on the recruitment and hiring teams, because people who relate to and have similar characteristics as the people on the recruiting teams, it can sometimes be favorable for people who are, or for the end result in ultimate hiring.
So we have a couple of questions that I want to respond to. And the first one is, could covering result in a hostile work environment claim? And I know that oftentimes Liz and I respond with maybe, but this time I'm going to give a super straight answer, yes. And I'm going to give you a hypothetical scenario. Let's say every week your senior leadership team at 4:30, and let's take the pandemic out of it, but let's say historically every week at 4:30 on Friday, your senior leadership team goes out to the bar. They all have an after work drink to end the week. And one member of the senior leadership team goes, the first time, and they get to the bar and they order a Sprite. And other members of the senior leadership team start ribbing the individual for not ordering an alcoholic beverage. And they're ribbing him, and they're telling him that he can't handle a beer, and what's his wife gonna start making fun of him when he comes home, or whatever the reason may be, but just general ribbing for not having that alcoholic beverage. Come to find out, however, that employee is an alcoholic, and we know that alcoholism is a disability. So we now have a situation in which the individual who is hiding the disability or covering the disability, which, it is their choice, and they didn't feel comfortable, however, explaining like, no, I'm not having a drink because I'm allergic to alcohol, or I have this disability, or whatever the reason is. In this case, if the individual is an alcoholic, that they're an alcoholic, right? And then because they then don't want to deal with the ribbing, and they don't go to that 4:30 drink every Friday, they just stay in their office and do their own thing, they stop getting assignments, that they don't get as good of assignments as their peers because they're not present to receive it. I think an argument could be made that it's a hostile work environment based off of the individual's disability, and the adverse action is the failure to receive the good assignments or the assignments that other people are experiencing. So that's just one hypothetical way in which covering can create a hostile work environment, but there are others. Liz, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would add, I really thought about that particular issue when we were talking about advocacy covering, and people not feeling comfortable speaking up for things that might be said, or jokes that might be made, or behavior that's going on in the workplace that relates to their group. So if somebody has a fear, or not a fear, but is covering their advocacy for that group, and that behavior continues and continues, that could potentially ultimately build a hostile work environment because of the failure to speak up. And of course, we want employees to speak up and feel comfortable with that. And so that just, I think, goes to the importance of creating an environment where people feel comfortable raising issues when they have them.
The second question is specifically regarding diversity of thought and political, I'd say political affiliation more generally within the work environment, and whether or not other employers or organizations are experiencing cultures within their work environment in which non-progressive kind of thoughts or ideas are generally being shut down. It's interesting because this is exactly what Google experienced. Those of you who may recall, about 4 years ago, I believe it was 2017, we the Google manifesto, as it's referred to, was leaked, which indicated that Google portrays itself as this very diverse institution and diversity of thought. But what they really mean is diversity of progressive or liberal thought, and that those with conservative viewpoints or Republican, what are labeled as Republican ideals, are shut down, and that they're not advanced, and that they don't have the same opportunities. And therefore, there's no true diversity within the organization. And I think it's important, especially now, to weigh the different aspects of it. And one of the things I think Liz and I have seen a lot more of recently is specifically with Black Lives Matter movement. When you have employees who say Blue Lives Matter or All Lives Matter, and that it's inequitable or unjust to just talk about Black lives, when honestly, it's that individual's belief that all lives matter. And weighing that viewpoint versus the viewpoint of your Black employees, and helping both employees and educating both employees to make sure that they both feel heard. Ultimately, your organization, however, will have to take a position on those things. Having open dialogues about diversity of thought is important to creating a diverse and inclusive work environment, but also understanding that the diversity of thought can't interfere with or diminish the rights of your other employees is really important. Liz, additional thoughts as to that?
No, I think that was well said, and I agree with your points.
So that's the end of the presentation. We thank everyone for their time today. Measuring failure and success, these are things that you guys are all aware of. Having a plan of action, accountability, training, communication, and not communicating to individual that someone was hired because of the diversity program. Everyone is hired and enters your organization based off of their own skills. So we appreciate everyone's attention. And if you have any questions or there's things that we covered that wasn't clear, please don't hesitate to reach out to Liz or I. Have a wonderful day. We do have a question.